August 6, 1945. 08:15 hours. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. What had begun 3 years ago as a war of ambitious conquest had devolved into a grim arithmetic of survival. The basement war room beneath the Imperial Palace was the nerve center of that survival. It sat 90 feet underground, a concrete tomb insulated from the war above by reinforced walls 4 feet thick. The air, tasting of stale smoke and ozone from the communications equipment, hummed with the familiar, grinding rhythm of a losing war. On the morning of August 6th, Field Marshal Shinroku Hata's morning intelligence briefing was underway, a daily ritual of managed decline, charting fuel shortages and rice rations with the same grim precision as enemy fleet movements. At precisely 08:15 hours, the heavy steel door to the war room burst open, shattering the funereal decorum. Communications Officer Lieutenant Colonel T-Shirt Yamamoto rushed in, his face pale. He forgot the customary bow, a breach of protocol so severe that every officer in the room froze. In his hands, he clutched a single decoded transmission. It was a message that would, in an instant, shatter 3 years of carefully constructed illusions about industrial warfare. The message was fragmentary, transmitted by the Hiroshima Regional Military Command just before all communications from the city ceased abruptly. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The transmission ended mid-sentence. The teletype machine that received it was now silent. General Yoshiro Umezu, the stoic chief of the Imperial General Staff, took the paper and read it 3 times. His mind, trained for logistics and conventional warfare, immediately rejected the premise. A single bomb was a tactical impossibility, an absurdity. His first assumption was logical, mathematical. This had to be the largest conventional bombing raid of the war. American B-29s, perhaps 500 of them, must have conducted a perfectly simultaneous drop of incendiaries. The mathematics seemed impossible otherwise. Hiroshima was a major industrial and military hub, a city of 350,000 people spread across 27 square miles. To erase, it would require a biblical rain of fire. But additional reports, trickling in through strained military channels throughout the morning, told a different story. A weather reconnaissance flight, one of the few Japan could still spare, had been near the city. Its report was stark. Only 3 American B-29s had been spotted over Hiroshima that morning. Admiral Suemu Toyota, chief of the Naval General Staff, stood rigid before the massive wall map that tracked every known American military asset in the Pacific. His intelligence staff had become exceptionally, painfully skilled at predicting American operations. They knew their bomber formations, their typical ordnance loads, and the expected damage patterns from a 3-plane formation. Nothing in 3 brutal years of air war, not even the firebombing of Tokyo, suggested that 3 aircraft could destroy an entire city. General Umezu stared at the report. 3 aircraft. Not 300. 3. The room fell silent as the implications, too terrifying to voice, settled over them like volcanic ash. By 10:00 hours, the sparse reports from the morning had been corroborated by something unprecedented. Reconnaissance flights attempting to approach the city relayed messages of a new, terrifying phenomenon. Pilots, their voices strained with disbelief over the radio, described a monstrous mushroom-shaped cloud rising over 40,000 feet, a column of smoke and fire visible from 150 miles away. They described a cloud that glowed with colors they had never seen in nature, sickly purples and churning oranges that seemed to pulse with a malevolent, internal light. Then, at 11:30 hours, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first coherent eyewitness account from a railway official who had been 15 miles outside Hiroshima when the bomb fell. The man's testimony, recorded by Togo's secretary, described a blinding flash brighter than 1,000 suns, followed seconds later by a pressure wave so powerful it knocked trains from their tracks. He reported, his voice cracking, that the entire city center had simply vanished, replaced by a raging firestorm visible from the mountains. The afternoon meeting of the Supreme War Council convened at 14:00 hours in a complete, suffocating silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, an old admiral who had already survived multiple assassination attempts by hardliners for even suggesting peace negotiations, looked at the men around the table. His hands, old and scarred, trembled slightly as he placed the accumulated reports on the polished wood. "Gentlemen," Suzuki began, his voice quiet but firm. "We must consider what this means." General Korechika Anami, the Minister of War and the most ardent, passionate advocate for continuing the fight to the last citizen, spoke first. His reaction was one of pure, visceral denial. "American propaganda," he snapped. "They want us to believe they possess weapons they do not have. Hiroshima was destroyed by conventional bombing, a lucky strike on the arsenal, and they're using this deception to." 3 aircraft, Admiral Toyota interrupted. It was a stunning breach of military etiquette. The admiral had cut off the war minister. 3 aircraft, Anami-san. "Our radar tracked them. Our observers watched them." 3. The word hung in the air. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was the sound of a fundamental truth collapsing. For 3.5 years, Japanese military doctrine, the very soul of their war effort, had been built on a single unwavering premise: American industrial might, their bus-san, could be overcome by superior Japanese spiritual strength, their seishin. The Americans could produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, that was a given. But Japanese forces, imbued with the warrior spirit, would fight with such ferocity, such disregard for death, that American casualties would become politically unbearable. This calculation had guided every decision, from Pearl Harbor to the kamikaze tactics off Okinawa. When American industry produced 300,000 aircraft, Japan's leaders told themselves that Japanese pilots, though outnumbered, would fight with 10 times the spirit. When American shipyards launched cargo vessels, so quickly they outpaced the German U-boats sinking them, Japan consoled itself that American sailors lacked the warrior's heart. But a single bomb that could destroy a city suggested something far more troubling. It suggested that American industrial and scientific capacity had reached a level that made Japanese resistance not merely difficult, but utterly meaningless. It suggested that America had been developing weapons of this magnitude in secret, while simultaneously fighting a 2-ocean war against 2 different empires. It suggested, in a terrifying flash of clarity, that America had not been fighting at full capacity. They had been holding back. The war they had been fighting was not the same war Japan was in. And it suggested that everything Japan's military leadership believed about the nature of modern warfare was now, in a single instant, obsolete. This stunned silence in the bunker was the sound of an entire worldview disintegrating. How could Japan's high command, men who prided themselves on strategic brilliance, have been so catastrophically wrong? The Japanese understanding of American power had been shaped by a series of carefully constructed beliefs, illusions that began long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. To understand the profound psychological shock of Hiroshima, one must first understand what they had convinced themselves was true. In November 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, had provided the most accurate and chilling assessment of American industrial capacity that any Japanese leader would offer during the entire war. His warning, recorded in Naval Staff minutes, was explicit and devoid of nationalist fervor. "I can run wild for 6 months or a year," Yamamoto stated, "but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." This was not a guess. Yamamoto had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had toured American factories in Detroit and witnessed the sprawling industrial infrastructure firsthand. His calculations were not based on hope, but on cold mathematics. America's steel production alone exceeded Japan's total industrial output by a staggering margin. American petroleum reserves were effectively unlimited compared to Japan's precarious dependence on imports, a dependence that had driven the very war they were about to start. But Yamamoto's warnings were systematically ignored, dismissed as the pessimism of a Western-tainted officer by the very staff now sitting in the underground bunker, contemplating Hiroshima's destruction. The Army strategic planning documents from 1941, recovered from archives after the war, revealed the alternative narrative that the military leadership had chosen to embrace instead. American industrial might, they argued, would be neutralized by three critical factors. First, distance. Japan's rapid conquests would secure a defensive perimeter so vast that American logistics would collapse under its own weight. Every ship, every aircraft, every bullet would need to travel 5,000 miles across a hostile ocean just to reach the battlefield. Japan, they reasoned, could sustain its forces from nearby conquered territories while America exhausted itself in a futile supply chain. Second, morale. American society was soft, individualistic, decadent, and utterly incapable of sustaining the heavy casualties that Japanese forces would inflict. Japanese military doctrine, rooted in the Code of Bushido, assumed that after losing 30,000 or 40,000 men, the weak-willed American public would cry for peace. The Japanese soldiers' willingness to die, their spiritual strength, would outlast America's willingness to fight. Third, tactical superiority. Japanese forces, through superior training, warrior spirit, and tactical innovation, like the A-6M0 fighter, would inflict casualty ratios so high that they would make America's numerical advantages irrelevant. In their planning, one Japanese soldier would equal 3 to 4 Americans in combat effectiveness. These assumptions had been tested and found wanting at every single engagement of the Pacific War. Yet, the Japanese High Command had consistently reinterpreted crushing defeats as validation of their theories, requiring only minor adjustments rather than fundamental revision. At Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single afternoon. The official assessment did not blame American cryptographic superiority or the deep vulnerability of Japan's strategy. It was attributed to bad luck and minor tactical errors. At Guadalcanal, from August 1942 to February 1943, Japanese forces discovered that Americans could sustain logistics across vast distances and could match, and even exceed, Japanese soldiers in brutal jungle warfare. The official assessment blamed local commanders for insufficient fighting spirit, not the impossibility of the strategic situation. By August 1945, every major assumption had been systematically demolished by reality. Yet, senior leadership had never formally acknowledged this. General Anamy's continued advocacy for fighting to the last citizen represented not stupidity, but the logical, tragic endpoint of beliefs that had never been properly questioned. The afternoon of August 6th marked the first time in the entire war that Japan's Supreme War Council confronted their illusions directly. As the shock in the bunker began to curdle into a cold dread, the meeting turned to intelligence officer Colonel Hideaki Sato. At 16:00 hours, Sato presented the afternoon's analysis. His team had been calculating American industrial capacity since 1941, and their numbers had been consistently, terrifyingly accurate. Now, he laid out what he called the reality assessment, a document his team had compiled over the previous 6 months, a report so bleak that General Anamy had prevented it from being presented until this very moment. The numbers were devastating. American aircraft production in 1944 alone exceeded Japan's total production for the entire war. American shipyards were building escort carriers faster than Japan could train pilots to land on them. American ammunition factories produced more shells in a single week than Japan's factories produced in an entire month. Sato read the figures in a low monotone. America had produced 88,410 tanks during the war. Japan had produced 6,450. America had built 41 aircraft carriers. Japan had built 15. But Sato's most damning statistics, the ones that truly silenced the room, involved scientific research. His intelligence network had documented American research facilities, employing over 130,000 scientists and engineers working solely on military technology. Japan's comparable effort employed approximately 6,000. American research universities, Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Chicago had larger physics departments than Japan's entire national scientific community. The atomic bomb, Sato explained, was the logical fruit of this disparity. It required facilities, he said, that we could not have built even if we had known how. The Americans had constructed entire cities in secret, places that did not exist on any map. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Hanford, Washington. Los Alamos, New Mexico. These facilities, dedicated to this one project, consumed more electricity than all of Tokyo. They employed 130,000 workers, many of whom had no idea what they were building. The Manhattan Project, Sato stated, cost the Americans $2 billion more than Japan had spent on its entire war effort in 1944. Foreign Minister Togo, his face ashen, asked the question that would echo through history, the question that hung over every man in that room. How could we not know a project of this magnitude? How? Sato's answer was uncomfortable, brutal, and accurate. We knew, Foreign Minister, he said, looking at his forbidden report. Our intelligence services reported on American industrial expansion continuously. We intercepted communications about large-scale secret projects. We documented their scientific recruitment efforts. But every report was dismissed as exaggeration or American propaganda. We chose not to know, because knowing would require acknowledging that we could not win. Admiral Toyota, the naval chief who had seen his fleet systematically annihilated, added his own bitter assessment, his voice thick with a new, horrifying understanding. The Americans, he said, fought this war with one hand tied behind their back. They fought Germany and Japan simultaneously while developing weapons we cannot even comprehend. They produced more war material than we thought physically possible, all while maintaining their civilian economy at levels that exceeded their own peacetime production. They are not merely stronger than us. They are operating on a different level of civilization. This was the admission that broke them. It was not just greater strength. It was a different category of capability. For 4 years, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as materialistic and weak, dependent on machines because they lacked spiritual strength. The atomic bomb, a weapon born from pure science and unthinkable industry, revealed this narrative as catastrophically, suicidally wrong. The psychological impact extended beyond simple military calculation. Cabinet Secretary Hizutsun Sakamizu recorded in his diary that evening, "We have been fighting an enemy we never understood. We assumed they thought as we thought, that their limits matched our limits. Hiroshima proves we were fighting blind. That blindness was about to be compounded." August 7th began with confirmation that made the Hiroshima report seem almost conservative. Reconnaissance aircraft, their crews flying through air still hot and electrically charged, finally penetrated the radiation zone. They transmitted photographs that would circulate among the high command within hours. Major Hidemian Kitamura, the pilot who flew the first successful reconnaissance mission, reported weather conditions he had never encountered in his career. Violent updrafts, born from the superheated ground, threw his aircraft 2,000 feet higher in seconds. Air temperatures spiked his instruments off the charts. Visibility was obscured by a column of smoke that still rose into the stratosphere. The photographs, developed by 11:00 hours, showed something that military analysts initially refused to believe. The city center, an area of approximately 4 square miles, had been completely flattened. Not destroyed in the conventional sense, where rubble and building foundations remained, but flattened to bare earth. Structures, bridges, and people had been vaporized. The reconnaissance team estimated that everything within a 1-mile radius of the blast center had simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Intelligence analysts immediately compared these images to the results of their most devastating conventional raid, the Tokyo firebombing of March 9-10, 1945. That attack, a pinnacle of conventional destructive power, had required 334 B-29 bombers, dropping 1,665 tons of incendiaries over 3 agonizing hours. Hiroshima's destruction, which clearly exceeded that raid's devastation, had been accomplished by a single bomb, from a single aircraft, in a single instant. The Supreme War Council reconvened at 14:00 hours on August 7th, still reeling from this new data, only to be hit by a second diplomatic hammer blow. A message had just arrived from Moscow. At midnight, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned the Japanese ambassador, Naoto Sato, to the Kremlin. The message was brief and brutal. The Soviet Union would consider itself at war with Japan, effective August 9, 1945. This announcement shattered Japan's final, desperate strategic hope. For months, Japanese diplomacy had worked frantically to negotiate Soviet mediation for peace terms. The fantasy was that Stalin, never fully trusted by his American and British allies, might broker an arrangement that preserved the emperor and prevented a full occupation. The Soviets entering the war eliminated this possibility completely. Witnesses in the bunker reported that General Annemy's face went pale as the implications registered. Japan now faced overwhelming enemies on all fronts: American atomic weapons from the east, Soviet armies from the north, British Commonwealth forces from the south, and Chinese resistance continuing in occupied territories. The empire was being compressed with crushing force. Then, on August 9th, as the Red Army launched a massive, overwhelming assault into Manchuria, a new message arrived. At 11:02 hours, communications from the Nagasaki Regional Command, even briefer than Hiroshima's, came over the wire. Second atomic attack. City destroyed. Casualties catastrophic. Then silence. The second bomb obliterated any lingering shreds of denial. The Supreme War Council's emergency session that afternoon descended into something unprecedented in Japanese military protocol: the open acknowledgement of complete and total strategic failure. The rigid adherence to honor and protocol dissolved into raw, unfiltered despair. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, a man who had long held private doubts, now spoke with remarkable candor. "The Americans have demonstrated that they can destroy our cities at will," he stated, his voice heavy. "One by one, until nothing remains. They have demonstrated the capability to continue this indefinitely. We cannot defend against weapons we cannot detect until they detonate. Our anti-aircraft systems are irrelevant. Our fighter aircraft cannot intercept what they cannot find. Our civil defense preparations, they are meaningless." Army Chief of Staff General Yamazu, the same man who hours earlier had tried to rationalize Hiroshima as a conventional raid, now added his own assessment, one that would have been considered treasonous heresy just weeks before. "The atomic bomb changes all fundamental military calculations," Yamazu admitted. "Concentrated forces become targets. Cities become targets. Our entire strategy of Ketsugo, of fighting to the last citizen, assumes the Americans must invade to occupy. But if they can destroy our cities without invasion, our entire defensive doctrine becomes obsolete. They can simply eliminate Japan from existence without ever setting foot on our soil." Intelligence estimates presented that evening calculated that America likely possessed between 3 and 7 additional atomic bombs, with a rapidly expanding production capacity for more. Even if this estimate was high, even if America possessed only one more weapon, the strategic implication remained identical. Continued resistance was no longer war. It was national suicide. Cabinet Secretary Sakamitsu recorded the Emperor's private comments from an audience that evening. His Majesty, Emperor Hirohito, spoke with a finality that superseded all military debate. "The unendurable must be endured," he stated. "The atomic bombs have demonstrated that continued resistance will result in the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. We must accept terms that preserve the nation, even if those terms are painful beyond measure. This phrase, endure the unendurable, would become the foundation for Japan's surrender. But the path from this private imperial acknowledgement to the public announcement was still treacherous. Military hardliners, led by a distraught General Anami, interpreted the Allied response to Japan's conditional offer as unacceptable. Their position was no longer based on any prospect of victory, but on a fanatic desire to preserve national honor through a final, glorious annihilation rather than accept the humiliation of occupation and foreign judgment. The war was lost, but the battle for the surrender had just begun. The surrender formalities extended through late August, but the psychological transformation of the Japanese high command was complete. What followed was not merely a military defeat, but a comprehensive, agonizing re-evaluation of everything they had believed about modern warfare, industrial capacity, and their own place in the global order. The formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, brought the Japanese representatives face to face with the physical manifestation of the American power they had so consistently and fatally underestimated. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who limped on his prosthetic leg to sign the instrument of surrender, recorded his impressions in his diary. The harbor, he wrote, was filled with American warships as far as one could see. Hundreds of vessels. Aircraft filled the sky in formations that blocked the sun. The Americans, he noted, displayed their power not through overt threats, but through simple, overwhelming presence. This single armada, anchored in their bay, represented only a fraction of America's total military force, yet it exceeded everything Japan had possessed even at the peak of its strength in 1942. General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Imperial General Staff, noted that the ceremony's location was itself a silent, brutal lesson in American capability. We surrendered aboard a battleship, he would later state, built in American yards in less time than it took us to plan a single naval operation. The Missouri was one of dozens of capital ships they constructed while simultaneously fighting across two oceans and developing atomic weapons. We prepared for this war for a decade. They prepared for 15 months and buried us. In September 1945, Intelligence Colonel Sato compiled his final report titled bluntly, Why We Lost, an Assessment of Strategic Miscalculation. The document, now preserved in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, was a masterpiece of brutal honesty, a complete autopsy of their self-deception. We lost the war in December 1941, Sato wrote. When we attacked an enemy we did not understand. Every battle thereafter was simply the working out of inevitable mathematics. American industrial capacity exceeded ours by factors of 10 to 20 in every category. Their scientific establishment was larger than our entire educated population. Their resource base was effectively unlimited, while ours depended on conquests we could not sustain. We fought believing spirit could overcome material. We were wrong. As the American occupation began, Japanese officials were given access to the full, uncensored data of American war production. The numbers confirmed their worst realizations. The United States had produced 88,410 tanks, 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. More staggering, they accomplished this while maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded Japan's own peacetime prosperity. Former Prime Minister Suzuki articulated what the leadership had finally grasped. We thought we were fighting a nation of merchants, he told occupation historians, who valued profit over honor, comfort over sacrifice. We were catastrophically wrong. We were fighting the most productive civilization in human history, one that could simultaneously sustain a mass consumer economy and total war production. They did not choose between butter and guns. They produced both in quantities we found incomprehensible. But the most humbling lesson remained the Manhattan Project. The atomic bomb was not merely a weapon. It was evidence of a scientific and industrial capacity that placed America in a different category of civilization. Admiral Toyota, the naval chief, wrote his final assessment in 1946. "We began the war," he wrote, "believing American democracy made them weak. Their diversity made them disunited. Their wealth made them soft. We ended the war understanding that democracy enabled innovation, diversity provided talent, and wealth funded capabilities we could not match. Every assumption we held was not merely wrong, but precisely backwards." By 1947, General Yumizu's testimony to historians summarized what the High Command had finally and tragically understood. "We lost because we never understood our enemy. We attributed to them our weaknesses, limited resources, inflexible thinking when they possessed the opposite. We believed our own propaganda when we should have believed our intelligence services. The atomic bomb was not the cause of our defeat. It was the final proof that we had been defeated from the moment we started fighting an enemy we never truly comprehended. We learned too late that courage cannot defeat chemistry. Spirit cannot overcome steel, and determination means nothing when facing an enemy who possesses both determination and 10 times your capacity to give it physical form."